to do that, and I always mean to, so I'm just going to say very quickly, the Leo Beck Institute is a library and archive dedicated to the preservation and research of German-speaking Jewish history. There are many locations. We are the biggest one here in New York, and that's the primary research center. And we have been here since 1955, and next year is going to be our 70-year anniversary. So I welcome everyone today, and now I will go forward and introduce Katherine Fennelly. Katherine Fennelly is trained as a social scientist and is an immigration policy expert whose work has taken her to many of the countries where her late grandfather lived out his adventures. And I think we've all read the book, so I think we can all say there were many adventures to discuss. She has studied and worked in Iran, Spain, and Ecuador, and done consulting work and academic residencies across Latin America and Europe. Katherine is a voracious reader and a lifelong student of languages. She discovered her family's Jewish roots only as an adult. It was something her Hungarian-American mother preferred not to discuss. When not tracking down classified documents and delving into family history, she volunteers for refugee service organizations, serves as a Spanish-English interpreter, and enjoys biking here in Brooklyn and Prospect Park and spending time with her daughters and granddaughters who live close by in Brooklyn. So I'm going to turn the event over to Katherine, who's going to present a slideshow for us about some aspects of the book, and then we will begin the discussion.
Thank you very much, Michael and Stephanie. It's a pleasure to be here. And it's a significant week since yesterday was Holocaust Memorial Day, and I had the pleasure of going to see the exhibit at the Center for Jewish History of the Anne Frank exhibit. And so the timing seems right. I'm going to put up some slides just to keep me on track. And I look forward to hearing from all of you after going through those slides. So let's see here. Oops, not the Zoom workplace. What I want is the PowerPoint slides. Here we go. Okay. This is just a picture of the cover of the book. And what I'm going to talk about very briefly today is my motives for writing this book, just a bit about how I undertook the research, and highlight of some of the findings. I describe myself as a very unlikely biographer of my grandfather because when I was growing up, he was living in Mexico. And this is a picture of one of the children's books he wrote in the 50s and 60s and 70s. 20 years of which he was living in Mexico. And that was much of what I knew about him, was that he wrote children's books. He lived in Mexico. He would send us, Mexican marionettes for presents and so forth. And then in 2015, I got a letter from a researcher in Vienna who told me he was writing a book about my grandfather's work as a spy in World War II. And I thought, oh my goodness, I didn't know that my grandfather was a spy. And then 3 years after that, my younger daughter gave me 23andMe, and I was very surprised to learn that on my mother's side, my grandfather, my maternal side, I'm 98.4% Ashkenazi Jewish. And I had grown up in an entirely secular household. We never went to religious services of any kind. And so that was really a surprise. And the combination of those things made me decide to do some research about my grandfather and to learn why some of these things had been hidden. So the way that I undertook the research is I began by interviewing people who knew my grandfather who were still alive, and in California and Spain and in Maryland. And then I went through government documents. I went to the National Archives, and I have a slide about that in a moment. Went through immigration records and ship manifests. I read extensively. Actually, I taught at the University of Minnesota for 16 years, and the library there is wonderful. And they would just send me any book I wanted that I couldn't obtain from the Brooklyn Library or the New York Public Library immediately. So, and I can get all kinds of journal articles that way too. So that was wonderful. And then, of course, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, if you have any genealogical research, they're just a treasure, as is Jewish Gen. And even if you're not Jewish, they're a wonderful resource for genealogical research. And you just have to subscribe to the Jewish Gen newsletter. I also went on social media. As the granddaughter of someone who was in the Office of Strategic Services, I was able to gain access to their social media site and pose questions, which experts from the OSS, which later became the CIA, were able to answer. And then I corresponded with experts on just a wide variety of topics that I won't go into today, but that were new to me. Onomastics, for example, I didn't even know that that's the study of name changes. And if you're interested in Jewish history, name changes are, in fact, a fascinating topic. And there are specialists in this and so forth. So here, this is a list of some other experts whom I consulted, and I found that other academics are usually very generous with their time and their willingness to answer questions. This is a photo of the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. And then what one does is to get, if the records have not been digitized, and although they're, doing their best to digitize records, there are still millions of records that are not digitized. And so I got boxes and boxes of these onion skin pages, which were from my grandfather's records when he was with the Office of Strategic Services. So who was Francis Goldnoy, my grandfather? Well, he was born in 1899 in what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This is a watercolor of him at the end of his life that was done by someone in California. When he was 15 years old, he joined the Royal Hungarian, or he was in the Hungarian Maritime Academy in part of Croatia, what was then, or what is now Croatia. It was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And then he joined the maritime services for the empire. And his brothers, here you can see to the right, his three older brothers, all of whom served in World War II and their father, of course, in the middle there. This may be the last photograph of the sons together with their father.
I think you meant World War I with that
Oh,
picture,
did
but
I say
yeah.
World War II? Of
Yeah,
course
but
I
that's
did.
okay. I knew you knew what you meant.
World War I, right. And then in 1919, well, they all served in World War I, and those were there. And that's when the empire existed. And of course, it collapsed after that. So in 1919, my grandfather was with as I said, the Imperial Merchant Marines, and he was on a Hungarian ship that docked in the United States in Philadelphia. And at the time, the restrictive laws, which really began, immigration laws that began in the 1920s in particular, were not in effect. And so he was able to enter legally with a seaman's visa. He later became a naturalized citizen. So one of the questions that was in my mind was, how did a Jewish Hungarian immigrant become a high-level spy for the Allies in World War II? And in fact, I gave a paper on this at the Center for Jewish History at the American Jewish Historical Society last May. And I used your archives to research this because what I found was that there was something called the Foreign Language Information Service, later became the Common Council for American Unity. And you have archives at the LBI on the FLIS. And this organization was created in 1918 to explain to foreign-born or to immigrants in the United States America's role in World War I and to foster their support and their patriotism. And my grandfather worked for them off and on for almost 20 years, for 2 decades. He was an editorial advisor, and he both prepared press releases for particularly Hungarian language newspapers published in the United States, and then he would translate and interpret editorials into Hungarian for the FLIS, for the Hungarian community. He also went back and forth to Argentina. His brothers, his two older brothers, settled in Argentina, became quite renowned architects there. My mother was born in Argentina. And then when the US joined World War II in 1941, my grandfather began working for what was called the Oral Intelligence Unit of the, well, it was the precursor to the Office of Strategic Services, and it was the Office of the Coordinator of Information, COI. And William Donovan was the director of the COI and then later of the OSS. So my grandfather began interviewing refugees from fascist occupied Europe and representatives of cultural organizations from Europe and learning from them and gathering intelligence basically on things like transportation systems and chemical production and where the Germans or the Italian fascists were, what they were doing in those countries and so forth. And he developed a database then. Of course, pre-internet, this was what one needed to do, is to develop a database that cataloged these human and tangible assets of the fascist governments in Europe and beyond. And it was a very valuable resource. And I've got letters, some of which you may have seen in my book, that attest to the importance of these documents and some examples of them. And then Ferko, we all called my grandfather Ferko. He was named director of the survey in 1943. This is a picture of him in his Office of Strategic Services uniform, and he worked for the OSS for the span of the war from December 1941 till December of 1945. And then in 1944, he became the head of a top secret branch of the OSS that was called X2. It's so top secret that there are still some documents from X2 that are not declassified even today, and some that were destroyed. But this branch was tasked with obtaining highly classified intelligence, again, on what was happening in fascist Europe. And in this case, he was recruiting and training other spies to sneak behind enemy lines to gather that information. And he was the head of X2 Balkans then. He was named the head in 1944. So his accomplishments were that he was recruiting, he was training resistance fighters right in the heart of Axis territory, particularly in fascist Italy, in Yugoslavia, and also Serbia, northern Italy, Bulgaria, and Hungary. Well, another question that then emerged for me was what was happening to my Hungarian relatives, my grandfather's mother and sister, nephew, another brother who were in Hungary in 1944 when he had such a key role in Allied war efforts in the region, and when, of course, the Hungarian Holocaust was beginning, or at least the suppression of Jews, tremendous suppression of Jews in Hungary was beginning. So what was happening to his family? Well, Hitler, you may know, invaded Hungary at the very end of the war when the Third Reich was on the verge of collapse, and the world was beginning to know about the atrocities of Hitler's final solution. And the reason that he invaded Hungary so late was that there were a number of countries that were defecting from the Third Reich, like Italy and Finland, Bulgaria, Romania, and he wanted to prevent Hungary from doing the same. But Hungarian Jews had lived after World War I and before the end of the 19th century, what was called a golden age for Hungarian Jews. And they believed, even after some of the atrocities in neighboring countries became common knowledge, I think many, many Hungarian Jews could not believe that this would happen in what they thought of as civilized Hungary, where the destiny of Jews and Magyars, Hungarians, had been intertwined for over 1,000 years. And that's a quote from Randolph Braham. And if you're interested in the Hungarian Holocaust, his book is a classic. And then, although the war was almost over when Hitler invaded, almost 600,000 Jews were murdered in Hungary in 12 months. That's close to 75% of the Jewish population. And very sadly, it could only happen with the complicity of hundreds of thousands of Hungarian nationals. Jews were said to be communists, and there was a very strong anti-communist sentiment in the country. And so I said, again, what happened to Ferko's relatives who were in Budapest after March of 1945? Well, in March of 1944, after the German invasion, um, just a month later, all Hungarian Jews were required to wear yellow stars on their clothing. And then Hungarian Jews in Budapest were forced to move into 2,000 yellow star houses in the city. Here's a picture of women and children in Budapest in that right after the German invasion being marched down the streets, Jewish women and children. And here's a yellow star house like the ones that my relatives were forced to move into. On December 2nd of 1944, my grandfather's sister, Borishka, at age 45, was brutally murdered in Aerocross headquarters. The Aerocross was the Hungarian fascist movement. And 1 month later, his mother died of heart failure, certainly understandable given what she was living through and the death of her daughter. And then Borishka's son and my grandfather's nephew, Dennis Noti, was shot to death at a labor camp up by the Austrian border on March 31st, 3 weeks before the Soviet liberation of the labor camp. So my grandfather was a complicated man. He was a war hero. I think many examples of that. He was also quite a flawed husband and father. He had many girlfriends. He abandoned my mother, her mother, and my aunt in Hungary at the height of the Depression before the Second World War began, but at a very difficult time. And so as I say, he was a complicated individual. Now, what did he do after the war? Well, at first, in 1945, he left the OSS and he settled in the Ojai Valley in California. And then in 1953, he fled to Mexico. And what I learned was that, of course, it was the McCarthy era, and at a time when there was a very strong anti-communist sentiment in the United States, and many of his friends and associates were caught up in that and fled as well to Mexico or other parts of the world. And then it was ironic because during World War II, the Allies supported the communist leader of Yugoslavia, named as Tito, because he was a strong nationalist and anti-communist, and that was government policy. But during the McCarthy era in the 50s, if you had anything to do with communists like Tito, you became suspect. So my grandfather spent 2 decades in Mexico. And while he was there, in this beautiful town of Valle de Bravo, which is just southwest of Mexico City. He wrote children's books, as I've mentioned before, but he also designed houses. He was not trained as an architect, although his older brothers were, and he spent time with them in Argentina. But he designed 25 homes in Mexico, beautiful places, to the extent that there's a journalist who wrote an article I read that who said that my grandfather changed the nature of Valle de Bravo because made it more of a tourist attraction because of the homes he designed with these kinds of European flourishes. He also was always a gourmand, a wonderful cook. He invented bread ovens and other implements for cooking, and he wrote articles about cooking for House Beautiful magazine in the 1960s. And this is just a page from one of those articles. In 1974, when he was 75 years old, he returned to the United States, and he rarely discussed his time in the OSS. Now, you had to sign a form saying that you would never reveal the details of your assignment, so that wasn't so surprising. But he never spoke of the Holocaust in Hungary. He never spoke of the murders of his sister or his nephew, and he only acknowledged our Jewish ancestry shortly before his death at age 93. that kind of hidden Jewish ancestry is actually very common. And you probably know that these are just a few examples of famous writers and figures. Tom Stoppard, if you've seen Leopoldstadt, you know about his hidden Jewish ancestry for many years and exploits of his family, and then Madeleine Albright and Richard Holbrooke and so forth. There are many reasons for this, and I spend a fair amount of time in the book talking about why these kinds of secrets about ancestry are common among traumatized groups. Well, first of all, they're measures that are intended as a coping strategy for many, as a mechanism for survival, to shield children and future generations, and as a response to continued anti-Semitism, which was rampant in Hungary, for example, and many other places after World War II. My grandfather died on December 2nd, 1992, ironically on the 48th anniversary of his sister's murder at the Aerocross headquarters in Budapest. Now, I'm not going to go into detail on this, but he had so many adventures in his life, and there were so many other aspects to what I learned about uh, life in Hungary and in my grandfather's time in the United States before the war and so forth. So these are other topics that I touch upon in Family Declassified. The last one, a detailed analysis of Ferko's children's books, was several paragraphs that I included that were written by my cousin, Wendy Brown, who's a political philosopher, formerly many years at Berkeley. She's at Princeton right now. And she wrote, I think, a really detailed and fascinating analysis of what is revealed in those children's books about my grandfather's beliefs. So I'm going to read a brief, just a few minute excerpt from my book, and then we'll open it up to questions. So what accounts for the silence of my grandfather and his family regarding the deaths of their close family members? Well, I've come to learn, as I said, that such silence is common among Jews around the world and among other victims of large-scale trauma. In my family's case, in my grandfather's case, anti-Semitism in Hungary surely played a role in suppressing information about our Jewish ancestry, and in Argentina, where, as I said, he spent quite a bit of time. And our family was also influenced by close ties to the politics in Argentina, where, again, my mother was born. But even more than that, than my grandfather's silence, what struck me was the silence of my mother and my grandmother, because I knew them intimately. Before writing this book, if you had asked me what it meant to be half Hungarian, I would have given examples so superficial and positive they might have been conjured by a director of tourism. I think of my grandmother Elsie's love of Hungarian music, how she would get up to dance the Csardas when we took her to Hungarian restaurants in New York to celebrate her birthday. I think of Ferko's soft Hungarian accent, cultivated and maintained after half a century in North and South America. I think of my mother's delectable stuffed cabbage leaves and homemade pastries. I remember her pleasure when a Yorkville shopkeeper said in Hungarian, "Keset chocolate," I kiss your hand, as she left his shop laden with cans of paprika and caraway seeds and smoked sausages. And years later, when she was dying and could no longer communicate with us, my nephew memorized that phrase and was rewarded with delighted giggles each time he said it aloud. But I understand now that these colorful images mask the horrors that my family members lived through in the 1930s and 40s. And in fact, not a day goes by now that I don't think about their fates and my own Hungarian heritage. So, thank you very much.